Well, as I look back over my life, I think I was almost born into computing. I was 5 years old and I started to school. And after about a month, my mother says, "Let me hear you read." My mother heard me read and she says, "I see I will have to teach you myself," her exact words. And she did. After a month, I took off on my own, following her advice. I had an interest in calculation from my earliest days. My dad felt being an electrical engineer that he needed another slide rule. He really didn't need one. So the slide rule was left for me. And in a week or two, I could do any ordinary problem solve the slide rule. But this didn't satisfy me. I had to understand how that slide rule worked.
Computing, it goes back to, I suppose, abacus and pencil and paper, but when you go from mechanical to electronic, that's the huge jump.
And I knew that I had to build a computer. And I was shaken when I realized that that's what my future was. I wasn't enthusiastic about it. I didn't want to do it. But I knew I had to. And I knew that I had the means. Some way I felt as if I had the internal means to do that.
And then we had the Anasoff Berry computer, which was just comes out of almost nowhere, out of the cornfields of Iowa, is this inventor who figures out for the first time how you can solve problems using binary logic. And that is what has led to the revolution in digital computing.
The world's first electronic digital computer was created by John Vincent Anasoff, a physics professor. His concepts have transformed our world, but the man himself remains a mystery. In history books and patent records, there's almost no mention of him or his invention. Instead, you find the story of a completely different computer.
Are people becoming obsolete? A giant electronic brain has started cogitating at the University of Pennsylvania. It's made of vacuum tubes like your radio, and it can add up a column of figures a yard long in a second. It's the world's first electronic computer. Right now, it's solving mathematical problems for the U.S. Army, but who knows, someday a machine like this may check up on your income tax.
The New York Times called it the greatest secret of World War II. It was called the ENIAC, and it was invented by a man named John Mauchly, along with Presper Eckert. In the family tree of computing, it's usually at the top. Almost every digital device is a descendant of the ENIAC. But for many years, no one realized the ENIAC itself was based on another computer. It would take 3 decades before the connection between John Mauchly and John Vincent Anasoff was revealed. The discovery, which would ultimately upend the entire industry, was made by a 29-year-old lawyer who was assigned the case of a lifetime.
My name is Charles Call. I'm a patent lawyer. I have been a patent lawyer most of my life, since 1960. In late 66 or the very beginning of 67, I was then a new young lawyer at the law firm in Chicago, a patent law firm, that had represented Honeywell for many years. And was called in by my senior partner, Dennis Allegretti, and said, I got this really big lawsuit that's probably going to take 5 or 10 years of your life. You want to sign on to something like that? I don't know whether I thought he was kidding or not, but it turned out he wasn't kidding. It took 5 years of my life.
Charlie Call was representing Honeywell, who were trying to get a start in the computer business. For Honeywell and a lot of small companies, the problem was the ENIAC patent, controlled by IBM and Sperry Rand.
You have to remember that in 1955, as late as 1955, IBM and Sprayran together had 95% of the business. They were not just the big guys in town. They were, both of them, the two 800-pound gorillas that were running everything. Sprayran asserted that there was no computer of any consequence at all being made that didn't need a license under this patent. So Honeywell would basically be out of the computer business without permission from Sprayran to continue, as would the other computer manufacturers. Our initial impression was it looked pretty hopeless. Everything that you read said that the first electronic digital computer was invented at the University of Pennsylvania by Eckert and Mauchly, and it was the ENIAC machine. This is just one of these things like, Alexander Graham Bell invented the telephone and so on. Eckert and Mauchly had become the recognized inventors of the electronic computer, and the ENIAC machine was recognized to be the first electronic digital computer. We had an uphill battle changing the perception, and we had to do that with evidence that was now nearly 30 years old. I began by going to the University of Pennsylvania, and the records of the ENIAC project were in boxes underneath the stadium seats at Franklin Field. So I spent a couple of weeks there just laboriously going through all of that stuff, getting names and finding out leads. I went to the Library of Congress to find things. A lot of the corporations like RCA and NCR and General Electric had done early work, and they were also accused with the infringement, so I would talk to their patent lawyers and get to talk to their people. So I had a lot to look at. And at some point, I was given a copy of the R.K. Richards book. It's a text on how computers work, but it has an introduction entitled History and Introduction. And at page 3, it said, and I'll read this, "The ancestry of all electronic digital systems appears to be traceable to a computer which will here be called the Atanasoff-Berry computer." That got my attention. That the ancestry of all computers appeared to be traceable to the Atanasoff-Berry computer. It was not long after seeing this that I persuaded my partners that we really ought to go see Dr. Atanasoff, and arrangements were made to come here to Frederick and do that. One of the things that impressed me first was this house itself. It's a very unusual house. It's kind of a fortress, so I think the three of us are climbing up out of the car and coming up to this imposing front door, and I'm sure I was nervous.
In 1967, I knew I'd spent a portion of my life on computer machines, but hardly anybody else knew anything about it.
And we had a lone genius who, if he had built something, nobody knew about it. And against all of the PR engines that had been working for a decade at least or more, extolling the breakthroughs that came from Sprayran and IBM. And it's going to be a tough sell, and I knew that, and against people that had much greater resources than we had.
The Honeywell people wanted to talk to me about what I knew about computing machines.
He'd had some prior encounters with lawyers that had not gone well, and so he was, like many people, probably rightfully, are a little wary of inviting lawyers in to talk with them and getting too involved with them. His wife, Alice, was there. She was very cordial. I think she served us coffee, and we sat down in couches and began to talk.
He wanted to talk to me about what I knew about computing machines, and I looked at my files and came up with a solid cubic foot of records.
Yes, this is particularly interesting. This was the document that I regarded as the chief piece of pay dirt and the Bible. This was the August 1940 manuscript that J.B. wrote, which told me what I needed to know to get really enthusiastic about this machine. This concept had so many principles in it which were completely novel, which are still being used today, and which I had not seen anyplace else. Nobody had designed electronic logic circuits that took data inputs and created a new logical output so that you could stick it back in memory. And that's the way all computers work today. You kind of take it for granted. I tell you, when you're looking around for somebody else that did it that way before 1940, you're not going to find it except with Atanasoff.
In order to break the ENIAC patent, Charlie Call had to learn everything about Atanasoff's machine. He had to prove it was truly the first electronic computer, and that the ENIAC was based on it.
There's a body of law that's built up about what is it that establishes a date upon which the invention was made. And it turns out the date that you're entitled to claim as your invention date is your conception date. That is, when you thought of the idea, when you had a complete conception of how it's going to be, coupled with diligence to a reduction to practice. The notion of when you think about it for the first time, when at first you have this flash of genius moment when you say, Eureka, I know how to do this. The question to Dr. Atanasoff, can you tell us when you thought about all this? And he says, I can. I can clearly remember how it happened.
In 1935, I had a number of graduate students working in theoretical physics. These students were having a great deal of trouble doing the calculations themselves. It took me back to the day when I was working on my own thesis, and they were spending much more than a month doing actual calculations. This problem of calculations pressed me very hard.
He told us his story about that he was just worrying and worrying and worrying about how to solve this problem. All his grad students were stuck. He was stuck. They couldn't get anything done because they couldn't solve these problems. So he started working on solutions, and nothing worked.
Now what did I do? I just sat down at the desk and started making pictures and thinking. Making pictures and thinking. This went on for months and months. I guess for a year and a half or 2 years, I hadn't yet in mind how I could build a computer. I didn't have in mind how I would ever reach my goal. And I went out, and I'll tell you what happened. I went out to my office one evening, and I tried to work on this and tried to work on that, and I became extremely irate with myself, and I was upset to an extreme degree. And then I did something that I have done only 2 or 3 times in my life. I went out and got into my car and started to drive, and I drove hard for several hours, driving hard enough so that I couldn't think about computers. I had to think about the road. And at last I said, well, Atanasoff, this is going far enough. You've got to do something. And then I glanced over, and I was crossing a bridge 189 miles from my starting point. Somebody has analyzed my situation. They said I was looking for a drink. Well, I wasn't looking for a drink until I glanced over and saw the water. And then I said, well, you're going into Illinois, and of course you can get a drink in Illinois. I drove on a bit, and I realized that this was a little roadhouse or tavern, and I drove up there and went in. I took a table and ordered a drink, and I turned again to the subject of computing machines. And all of a sudden I realized that my mental capacity had improved markedly. I knew immediately that I could think things through, and I knew immediately what I had to do. The whole structure would be substantially electronic. I was going to use the binary number system. We were going to use the capacitor memory, and we would have electronic logic circuits. And as I look back over that era, I realized that these four steps that entered my mind at the honky-tonk are in every computer today.
Deep in the basement of Iowa State's physics building, with the help of a young grad student named Clifford Berry, Atanasoff turned his concepts into a computer, which he called the ABC.
So what we are looking at is a replica of the Atanasoff-Berry computer that was constructed in 19 1940, roughly, 1939, 1940, and made to work to solve systems of equations. It was the first electronic digital computer. None of the computing was done with mechanical, like a mechanical calculator of that era. All of it was done with binary logic and ones and zeros like we use now.
Atanasoff's computer introduced a brand new way of thinking. Up until then, calculators were mechanical, counting by moving gears and levers, like an abacus. Atanasoff's machine calculated using electrons, but at the time, almost nobody understood just how significant that was. When Atanasoff approached IBM to invest in his machine, they refused.
A member of the IBM staff told me that IBM would never build an electric computer. Never build an electric computer.
At the time, IBM was actually in the middle of building a giant mechanical computer called the Mark I. It was 51 feet long and cost over $200,000. In the age of analog computers, bigger meant better. In comparison, Atanasoff's digital computer was the size of a desk and cost only $5,000. But there was one person who understood the significance of his invention. In December 1940, at a science convention in Philadelphia, Atanasoff met a fellow professor, John Mauchly. Mauchly was giving a lecture about predicting weather patterns using an analog calculator. After the talk, Atanasoff explained his electronic computer, and Mauchly was immediately interested.
Turned out this man from the Middle West, Dr. Atanasoff from Iowa, was indeed trying to build a computer. And he told me he could do it very cheaply. That was interesting. And come out to Iowa and he'd show it all to me.
We were not unaware when we came to visit JV that first time in this house that Mauchly had been said to have been there and visited the product. Richards had alluded to that in his book. It was going to be essential that we be able to prove not just that the computer existed and it was built and it was workable, but the crucial thing was that we had to prove that John Mauchly had seen it, learned about it, and gotten key concepts which he used later on and tried to patent with the ENIAC patent. We had to prove that got derived from Atanasoff.
Well, I couldn't get out there until the following summer, which was the beginning of the 41 summer.
It was a warm June day that Mauchly came to visit for 5 days and learned what Atanasoff had accomplished. Their sons, John and Jimmy, played in the backyard while they talked about all the technical things that Atanasoff had invented. And Atanasoff allowed Mauchly to see the 35-page manuscript. Mauchly asked to borrow it, and while he was borrowing it, he also got paper out of the office and was seen working late at night with the light on, presumably copying by hand everything that was in there.
Mauchly had a burning interest in computing machines after I told him about my activity, and we talked about the computing machine, and we made, at least during the weekend, at least one visit over to my computing laboratory. Mauchly was, on all occasions, absolutely ecstatic. He thought it was the last word and the final thing. He thought nothing was going as well as this was. He thought that this was the foremost project of the world.
I think we were comfortable that we had established the timing of the machine, the timing of its construction, its state of construction when Mauchly was there, the fact that he was there for several days, discussions were free and open, he had read the manuscript, he later on, after that, exchanged correspondence with Atanasoff, which suggested and confirmed that indeed he was there and did learn about the machine. I think we felt like we had all we needed to have. And we told Atanasoff that we weren't sure that Mauchly would admit to this. We didn't know what he would do. We wondered if Atanasoff had any idea. Had he ever talked to Mauchly? He didn't know either. There had been no contact between those men for a long time. So Mauchly's response to this, if we brought it up, was unknown. But I had learned somehow that Dr. Mauchly had been invited to speak at a panel on the history of computers that was being held in D.C. And that was happening, as I recall, the next day after I was here with Dennis Allegretti and Henry Halliday. They went on back to the Midwest, and I stayed over and went to the conference.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Isaac Auerbach, the chairman of this session, entitled, In the Beginning, Reminiscence of the Creators.
Just to my surprise, the moderator of the panel introduced Dr. Mauchly by saying, there's a mention in this R.K. Richards book that there was a computer out at Iowa State that you had gone out to see.
Before calling on John Mauchly, I'd just like to inject the development of a computer that is not as well known to many of you as it might be. It's a computer called the Atanasov-Berry computer.
I got the impression that Mauchly was totally blindsided by this.
And indeed I did visit the Iowa State University premises at his invitation and looked at something which at that time wasn't working.
Kind of a deer in the headlights attempt to say, oh, don't pay no attention to that man behind the curtain. The gist of it was, as I recall, that yes, he'd been out to see something, but it was not really that interesting, and it was he didn't learn very much because it was covered over by a tarpaulin, and he was only there for 10 minutes or something. It had no correspondence at all to the truth that I had heard, that I now knew that we could almost certainly prove about what had really happened. So my reaction was, if he continues to take that position, we win because we can prove that isn't true. They're gonna have to figure out a better story than it didn't happen, because it did happen.
In the case of Honeywell versus Berry Rand, it was important to show not only that Mauchly had seen Atanasov's computer, but also what happened next. Did ideas from the ABC make their way into the ENIAC?
Mauchly went to visit Atanasov, spent 5 days with him, learned everything because Atanasov was totally open. When Mauchly came back, he took a course in electronics at the Moore School, and there met Eckert. Eckert was 12 years younger than he. He was very impressed by his brilliance and by the fact that the two of them could seem to mesh in their interests. And they sat around after class talking about computers, and the two of them began to work together. The Aberdeen Proving Ground was in the process of calculating firing tables, which had to be extremely precise and were very complex, and they had rooms full of Wax and other women. They were all women for some reason, trying to compute these firing tables on tabulating machines, which weren't good enough on electromechanical equipment. So that Aberdeen wanted a computer, an electronic computer, and Eckert and Mauchly had the goods.
John Mauchly and I and a few other engineers around there worked night and day without any sleep for a couple of days and cranked out a proposal. It was then looked at by the Army people who said they were interested.
During that time, Mauchly wrote to Atanasov and said, how would you feel about my building an Atanasov calculator? And Atanasov said, well, he wanted to hold off and try and get a patent on the ABC.
But like most people of his generation, Atanasov's fate would be dictated by the events of World War II. He left Iowa for Washington to work at the U.S. Navy Ordnance Lab. The office he worked in required a high level of security clearance, so he was surprised one day by an unexpected visitor, John Mauchly. Over the next year, Mauchly dropped by from time to talk about computing. On his final visit, he revealed to Atanasov just what he was doing for the Army, building them a computer.
In 1943, Mauchly declared that he had found a new way to build a computer. I asked him to tell me how, and he said he couldn't, it was classified. I really believed him pretty much. I pretty much believed him.
On the surface, the ENIAC was massively different from the ABC. The ENIAC filled an entire room. It used 18,000 vacuum tubes and weighed 30 tons. It reportedly dimmed the lights of Philadelphia every time it was turned on. When Atanasoff returned to Iowa after the war, he would find out that his computer was gone. Iowa State never filed the patent application, a mistake they would later calculate cost them over $4 billion in lost revenue.
He was very surprised and disappointed that, first of all, the machine had not been patented, that nothing had been followed up on that, and then you can imagine how he felt when he discovered in the late 40s that his machine had been dismantled and that the parts, they didn't even know where most of them were.
I didn't have a patent because Iowa State College forced me to sign a patent contract with them and refused to pursue the patent.
Oh, yes. They
but
neglected the very important thing.
Neglect. And I shouldn't have stood for it, but I did.
He was pretty emotional. It was a tough part of his life because his work was destroyed. And my theory was, let's not worry about it, let's go on and enjoy life. And that's what we did.
As Atanasoff filed away sketches and diagrams, Eckert and Mauchly moved forward. They patented the ENIAC and founded the world's first computer company. The computer had been an obscure device for scientists and the military. But by the 1950s, computers helped with the census and predicted elections. By the 60s, even Batman would have a computer. The ENIAC was on its way to becoming one of the most valuable inventions in the world. One person that took notice was Tom Watson, the head of IBM. IBM's business was based on tools like punch cards, tabulators, and the typewriter, products the electronic computer would eventually make obsolete.
Tom Watson was worried and concerned because of the great press that ENIAC was getting and wanted to get the company into electronics. And of course, there would be a concern that there were or would be patents on the ENIAC which would hamper IBM. So the first idea they had was to challenge the ENIAC patent, and they sent their lawyer, Etienne, out to see Atanasoff.
We had subpoenaed IBM's records, asking them to turn over everything they had about Atanasoff, and that file revealed that they had had a long time interest in Atanasoff. They had records about their dealings with him before the ABC was even invented. I don't know if we saw them all, but we saw a lot about their patent people's knowledge of the ABC in the early 50s and thereafter.
A patent attorney from IBM came by and wanted to talk to me. He had found out about Mauchly's patents, and he says, if you'll help us, we'll destroy the Mauchly patents because they were derived from you. Those were his exact words. I wasn't quite sure how I should react. I hadn't myself formulated that opinion.
Atanasoff was suddenly very excited. He never thought that there was a possibility of resurrecting this poor old machine that he had built.
Atanasoff waited to hear back from IBM's lawyers about challenging the ENIAC in court. But to his surprise, they never contacted him again. IBM had another plan on how to deal with the ENIAC patent, which was now owned by their rival, Sperry Rand.
But he kept saying, what's happened to IBM? Why have I not heard from them? He also believed that IBM must have lost interest in this, and that if IBM couldn't break the ENIAC patent, nobody could. So what happened, meanwhile, was that IBM decided that instead of challenging the ENIAC patent, it would be better to negotiate a deal with Sperry to have a cross-licensing agreement.
We didn't have a lawsuit against IBM. That was not, but we did have a lawsuit against Sperry Rand, and our position was that this deal that IBM and Sperry Rand struck was a problem in a number of ways. One of them was that IBM, we felt, knew a lot of what was wrong with these patents, and when they settled it, they were silenced as a voice to oppose them.
After 4 years of legal preparation, the trial of Honeywell versus Sperry Rand began hearing testimony on June 1st, 1971. 77 witnesses would be called, including Edward Teller, the father of the hydrogen bomb. But the two most important witnesses were Atanasoff and Mauchly.
Tell us what transpired in connection with the computing machine.
Took Dr. Mauchly over by myself in my car. At the time, Dr. John W. Mauchly visited Iowa State College and visited the computing machine project there. The machine had a general appearance not too different from this.
We had the burden of proof. It was our job to get this all together. The difficulties with Atanasoff continued to be the ones that we'd always face, which was that this was a lone inventor out in Iowa, working in the basement of the physics department. Unless we could prove that Mauchly saw it, understood it, and carried that knowledge away with him when he left Ames, it didn't matter. We knew that it was not going to be in Mauchly's interest to do anything but minimize this, minimize the extent to which he learned anything, minimize the willingness of people to tell him anything, minimize what he was allowed to see, and maximize the notion that this wasn't really anything new to him because he thought about all these ideas already.
Mauchly particularly emphasized in his testimony that whatever he learned from John Atanasoff in Iowa, Mauchly's ideas did not derive from Atanasoff.
I think the initial hope by Dr. Mauchly, and I'm sure with Sperry, was that they could just make this go away. To say, well, it might have happened, but it was no big deal because I didn't really learn anything I didn't already know, and it was getting brushed aside. Obviously, we couldn't let it get brushed aside.
What Honeywell had on their side was the sheer volume of evidence, over 25,000 items. For the first time in a U.S. court, a computer was used to keep track of all the evidence, playing a key role in the trial that would decide its own origins.
485 of the the carbon copies of 2 pages of a letter written by me to Dr. John W. Mauchly, written by me to Dr. John W. Mauchly. Of a letter from Dr. John W. Mauchly to me.
The documents are showing he was there for a long time. The discussions were free and open. He learned everything he needed to know. There was a good chance that Mauchly had some things too. He had been subpoenaed and required to bring all the documents that he had in his possession that had anything to do with Atanasoff, and he showed up with a very small stack. So one of the first orders of business at that deposition was to find out what kind of search he had done, and it turned out he really hadn't looked very hard. Second session of his deposition, he brought back a box full of stuff. I had found this letter that Mauchly had written to H. Helm Clayton. It did not appear that from what happened that Mauchly knew it was in his files, had seen this letter, had thought about it. So I give the letter to Henry, who was the most gifted trial lawyer I've ever seen. I'm thinking, well, this isn't going to help much. It doesn't say much more than what we know already. And Henry took the letter and looked at Dr. Mauchly and said, Dr. Mauchly, isn't it a fact that you told your good friend H. Helm Clayton that you'd been out to Ames and seen this machine? And you can see this deer-in-the-headlight expression, okay, what do I do now? So this went on for like 2 hours, that Henry is walking around the room carrying the letter, periodically, would find some other little tidbit that's in the letter suggesting that it knows the letter, and Mauchly changed his story.
maybe he wasn't as precise as he should have been. He was not a lawyer. He wasn't thinking he was writing for the history books necessarily.
I do remember when, at the end of this, Dr. Mauchly said, I want to see that letter. And he looked at it, and his face dropped because he realized, I didn't need to admit all that. It doesn't say anything.
I'd like to quote to you from a letter, September 30, 1941, from John W. Mauchly to J.B. Atanasoff.
Mauchly had written a letter to Dr. Atanasoff basically saying, would the way be clear to me if I chose to do it, to build a machine like yours? And he said, I'm thinking about building an Atanasoff computer a la Bush differential analyzer.
And I quote, is there any objection from your point of view to my building some sort of computer which incorporates some of the features of your machine being the Atanasoff Berry computer?
He's asking for permission to build an ENIAC because the differential analyzer was used to solve firing table problems. And so he's asking Atanasoff, would the way be clear? If I did this, would you give me a license if you got a patent or whatever?
The key issue is whether or not John Atanasoff gave to Eckert and or to Mauchly ideas that were embodied in the claims of the patent. That's what we're really talking about. And what is said back and forth in letters is can often be a red herring.
This was not a letter that said, I'm thinking about using your ideas, but I really don't understand it. I need a lot more information before I get to use the ideas. He's saying, I'm thinking about using your ideas. There's no suggestion in that letter at all that he didn't fully understand what he saw and that he wouldn't know how to go forward and use those ideas without more help from Atanasoff. It really had to do with this fundamental question of, did Dr. Mauchly and Mr. Eckert have the right to claim that they invented the computer and nobody else had the right to build one without their permission? That was what the lawsuit was about. And that had everything to do with Dr. Mauchly's credibility.
It can best be described as the trial of the century. Two inventors, both holding a claim on the first computer. Testimony from the highest levels of industry, science, and the military. And while the trial was technically two companies wrestling over a patent, the decision would affect everyone who would ever use a computer. On October 19th, 1973, 5 years after Honeywell first issued their challenge, Judge Earl Larson delivered his verdict. Eckert and Mauchly had derived the ENIAC from the work of John Atanasoff. One of the most valuable patents in the world was declared no longer valid. And just like that, the electronic computer was no longer controlled by Sperry or IBM, or anyone.
The essence was that he believed, Judge Larson concluded, that the Atanasoff Berry computer was real, that Mauchly had been there, that he learned all that he needed to know about it, that he took it back. The inventions that were being claimed in the ENIAC patent, basically this supposed invention of the electronic digital computer, that Eckert and Mauchly had not invented that, but had in fact derived it from Dr. Atanasoff.
But for Atanasoff, recognition would not come easily. The verdict was released at the height of the Watergate scandal, which overshadowed the decision. And despite the verdict, it seemed as if the legacy of the ENIAC would not disappear overnight.
With all due respect to Judge Larson, I remember at the time that when the opinion came out, I disagreed with the judge's findings.
The hope was, okay, now the judge's decision has laid that to rest. Nobody's going to have the guts to say Eckert and Mauchly invented the computer anymore, right? No, they kept saying it.
Did John Mauchly and Presper Eckert still claim to be the inventors? And their position was that Judge Larson erred?
To say that we got any kind of help at all, really, from Atanasoff is total nonsense and totally inaccurate.
I did ask Mauchly about his visit to Ames, And Mauchly said, I didn't get anything out of that visit except the royal shaft later.
The interesting thing from the point of view of Atanasoff and me was he was a computer dropout. He just didn't seem to have any interest in computers. But he turned up in a lawsuit later. So that's one comment on history, you might say.
Sperry Rand actively fought to perpetuate the myth. Sperry Rand was very proud of the tracing their genealogy back to the ENIAC machine. They spent money on documentaries. They gave a lot of money to the Smithsonian and helped them set up an ENIAC exhibit. They did everything they could to pretend that the court case didn't happen and that the version of history that everybody had followed so long was still true.
Although the public might not have understood the significance of the trial, its repercussions would be felt for decades to come. The verdict released the computer from the control of a single company. Inventors were free to take Atanasoff's fundamental concepts in new directions.
First computer I designed became the Apple I eventually. I passed it out for free. I gave away all my designs, all my code, no copyright notices. Here, build your own, build your own, build your own. And the Homebrew Computer Club grew to about 500 people, meeting every 2 weeks in 1975. And we would discuss all sorts of computer ideas and sociological ideas, how computers were going to change society. And we felt it was a revolution. We felt that, whoa, this is a big stride forward because now real people will be able to afford a computer, not just the big companies. And we were going to empower the little guys.
The legacy of Atanasoff would be not only inventing the original electronic digital computer, but also breaking the ENIAC patent, which paved the way for future innovation.
That really opened up the world. It opened up vast degrees of competition. It opened up all kinds of innovation. If we can imagine a world where we had one company with a patent on the computer, no one else were able to produce a computer, the next thing you know, Microsoft would have never happened, the internet would have never happened.
I'd much rather have tens of thousands of people thinking about how to make this stuff better or how to use it than have it all locked up somewhere and preventing anybody from figuring out any new ways to use it. The internet wouldn't be what it is were it not for the fact that there are millions of people who can try new ideas out every day without asking anyone's permission. I'm sure that Atanasoff saw a lot. Even he passed away in 1995. He had the opportunity to see the fruition of what he had started. It's, I think, a tribute in a way to the power of the whole concept of computing, the stored program computing, that you could go from Atanasoff's machine, the ABC machine, to the world today, which has 4.5 billion programmable mobiles and more than 1 billion computers at the edges of the net. It's all the same notion. It's just evolved and elaborated over an enormously, 60-year period.
I would like to see Atanasoff remembered the way we remember the Wright brothers, as the person who put everything together to make something really happen in a revolutionary way. That there have been other people who have contributed to the technology before and since, but the big step forward was made by John Atanasoff. That's how I'd like to see him remembered.
Now it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. John Atanasoff, who is going to tell his story of the invention of the first electronic digital computer.
I'm very grateful that fate should have placed me at the beginning of this great adventure. I had great expectations, but none that matched present achievements, and none that could possibly match what we all expect of the future. Since the beginning, Many men have worked on computing, and many have furnished elements that were important. This applies to Mauchly, Eckert, some members of the staff, such as Burks, Brainerd, and others. Historically, the list should contain Pascal, Napier, and Zuzel. Credit must also go to the originators of our number system, which began computing. What each man accomplishes depends on his brains and energy, but also on the surrounds in which he works. In this, timing is important. In a larger sense, no man invents anything. He builds and extends a little with his friends and on the shoulders of others.